Another topic that can be found in Chapter 6 is related to segments. Now, segments are ways in which a corporation or company may be broken down based on geographic market, based on product line. Maybe you have a central, east, and west segment. Maybe you have a product line that goes to consumers versus businesses, or governmental versus non-governmental. It's a way in which you may break your company down to in components or segments that are similar to one another, so that you better understand what's happening with the company. Because sometimes if you understand better what's going on with each segment, it may be that one segment is operating at a particular loss and you need to revisit that segment. And so it helps you understand what's contributing to what's going on company-wide. So in this example, we have Sterling Company, and we can see through this company-wide income statement that right now they're operating at a loss. They're showing a $33,000 loss on sales of $1.5 million. Now, what we also know is that they divide themselves down into three segments by geographic market: the South, the Central, and the North. And what you can see here is that $1.5 million in sales can be allocated to each of those segments: South, Central, North, 400, 600, 500, respectively. And if you look at the company-wide financials, you can see variable expenses run 39% of sales, but we can break that down further and see that variable expenses for the South are at 52% of sales, Central only 30%, and North 40%. So that 39% is actually a blended percentage. And again, by looking at the income on a segment basis, we can learn more. Then you'll notice this line item called traceable fixed expenses. We have a grand total of fixed expenses of $945,000. Traceable fixed expenses, if you run the total, are only $770,000. Now, here's the difference. Traceable fixed expenses, you can see $240 for the South, $330 for the Central, $200 for the North. Those are fixed expenses that are traceable to that segment, which in essence means if the segment goes away, those expenses will go away. Now, you'll also notice that they do not total $945,000, which is the total for the company. That's because some fixed expenses are common to the entire company. They aren't directly related to each segment. If any of those segments goes away, the common expenses will remain the same. That's critical in evaluating what is happening to generate this $33,000 net operating loss. Let's look at this other spreadsheet wherein I've put together what's called a segment-based income statement. Now, you'll notice I have for each geographic market, South, Central, and North, I have come down to what I've called a geographic margin. That's because their segment is based on geography, but it's basically a segment margin. We've talked about contribution margin. What is the product contributing to cover fixed expenses and contribute to profit? Segment margin is what is the segment contributing to cover common fixed expenses and contribute to profit overall. So let's look at South. South sales were $400,000. We know that variable expenses were given to us at 52% of sales. And so we have variable expenses of $208,000. That leaves us with a contribution margin from the South of $192,000, out of which has to come their traceable fixed expenses, which for the South was $240,000. Now, what that tells us is the South is generating a loss of $48,000. Now, if we look at Central, we see sales of $600,000. Keep in mind their variable expenses were 30% of sales, so that was only $180,000. Contribution margin, then, the difference is between those two is $420,000, out of which must come their traceable fixed expenses, which were only $330,000. That leaves us with a geographic margin or a segment margin of $90,000. So whereas the South is kind of bleeding the company, the Central is contributing $90,000. And then finally, the North generated $500,000 in sales. Their fixed expenses run 40% or $200,000, leaving them a contribution margin of $300,000. Their traceable fixed expenses are $200,000, leaving a segment margin of $100,000. So notice what's happening. That $33,000 net operating loss is predominantly the result of what's going on in the South. Once we break it down by segment, Central and North are making a contribution to the company. The South isn't. Now, notice under the total company side, what I've done there, those are basically down through geographic margin, just the sum of the South, Central, and North. From that leaves us a total segment margin of $142,000, which is the contribution margin of $912 minus the traceable fixed expenses of $770. We subtract from that our common fixed expenses. Again, these are fixed expenses that don't relate directly to any of the segments, but yet are incurred by the company overall. And notice we're not allocating them to South, Central, or North. This is a concept of responsibility accounting. South, Central, North, the segments themselves have no control over those fixed expenses. Now, the company can choose to allocate them if they want, and that's fine, but the segments shouldn't be evaluated based on them because they have no control over them. And certainly, since they have no control over them, it doesn't help us to understand how well the segment's doing if we incorporate the allocated common expenses. So we subtract those from the geographic margin, total of $142,000, and there's our net operating loss of $33,000. So what do we do with this information? Well, what it does is it highlights that the primary contributor to this loss is the South. So we need to look at the South. Do we get rid of that margin? Not necessarily. There's maybe a lot of reasons why we need presence down there, but we may want to look at why the South is generating such a loss and see what we can do about it. I mean, right off the top, you can see they have the highest variable expenses of any of the geographic markets. So that's right away something we need to investigate. Assuming our product is the same within each of these geographic markets, why is there such a significant difference from one market to the next in variable expenses? There may be, I mean, obviously costs run differently in different markets, but it raises the question. And then our fixed expenses, which oftentimes are more easily controllable than our variable expenses, are off the charts as it compares to the other markets. Central is running at 55%, North is running at 40%, South fixed expenses are 60% of sales. Why? What's going on with that? So it's not so much the decision to, oh, South is not contributing, let's get rid of them. Before you make that decision, you want to look at these numbers and figure out what may need to be fixed so that the South is operating at a more profitable amount. But we do now know that South is the contributor to the loss as opposed to Central and North, so we can focus our efforts